Welcome back to Off the Record. I'm Amy, and I can't stop thinking about something that keeps coming up when you really look at music history. How often the music industry gets it wrong. Not in small ways, not in hindsight only kind of ways, but in moments where artists were mocked, punished, silenced, or turned into cautionary tales, only for us to realize years later that they were never the problem. The system was. So today, we're talking about moments when the industry got it wrong, when artists or songs were punished for being honest, uncomfortable, or ahead of their time. And I know I've talked about Sinead O'Connor several times in this podcast, but her story, it just it doesn't sit right with me. So we're going to talk about her again in this episode. Sinead O'Connor is one of the clearest examples of what happens when an artist speaks too early. In 1992, during a live performance on Saturday Night Live, Sinead tore up a photograph of Pope John Paul II and held the pieces up to the camera. The moment lasted seconds, but the fallout lasted decades. Immediately, she was condemned across media. Radio stations stopped playing her music. Industry figures publicly distanced themselves from her. At a Bob Dylan tribute concert shortly after, she was booed so loudly she couldn't finish her performance. Her career never fully recovered. At the time, the narrative was simple and cruel. She was labeled unstable, dramatic, someone asking for attention. But what she was actually doing was sounding an alarm. Sinead later explained that the act was a protest, a warning about abuse within the Catholic Church and its long history of protecting abusers. She wasn't making a metaphor. She was saying, pay attention. Years later, those truths became undeniable. But by then, the damage had already been done. The industry didn't protect her. It didn't investigate her claims. It punished her. Not for being wrong, but for being early. Next, we're going to talk about the Chicks, formerly the Dixie Chicks. In 2003, the Dixie Chicks were at the absolute height of their fame. They were one of the biggest acts in country music. And then, during a show in London, lead singer Natalie Maines said this song stage. We're ashamed the President of the United States is from Texas. That was it. One sentence. The backlash was immediate and overwhelming. Country radio stations blacklisted their music overnight. Fans organized public CD destruction events. They received death threats. Their careers were effectively derailed for expressing a political opinion, something male artists had done for decades with far fewer consequences. What's important to understand here is how coordinated the punishment was. Radio play disappeared instantly. Industry support vanished. Silence replaced success. Years later, the band made another intentional decision. They dropped the word Dixie from their name, not as a rebrand, but as a reckoning. They acknowledged the term's connection to the Confederacy and chose to move forward in a way that aligned with their values. The industry didn't stand by them, but time did. Now their story is widely recognized as a case study in how outspoken women, especially in traditionally conservative genres, are punished for dissent. Next, we're going to talk about Britney Spears. Britney Spears' early 2000s treatment is difficult to revisit because it was so public and so normalized. She was one of the most famous people on the planet, and still, she was treated as disposable. Her body was dissected, her relationships were turned into punchlines, her mental health struggles were treated as entertainment. Interviewers asked invasive, inappropriate questions, and audiences laughed along. When Britney began to struggle publicly, the narrative shifted quickly. She was no longer a person under pressure, she was a spectacle. And instead of offering support, the industry leaned into the chaos, profiting from her breakdown while distancing itself from responsibility. Only years later did the public begin to admit what this really was. Not fame gone wrong, but systemic exploitation. Next, we're going to talk about one that's very dear to my heart, Kurt Cobain. Kurt Cobain never wanted to be a symbol. He wanted to make music that felt honest. But when Nirvana exploded into the mainstream, he became something he deeply resisted, a spokesperson for a generation. Kurt spoke openly about his discomfort with fame, with commercialization, with the way his art was being consumed and misunderstood, but those concerns were often dismissed. He was told this was the price for success. The industry celebrated the image of Kurt Cobain, but it didn't listen to the person. And that disconnect between the art and the human being created immense pressure. Pressure the system had no interest in alleviating. There's one more thing I want to say here, and I want to say it carefully, because this is a real person, and this is a real loss. Kurt Cobain's death was officially ruled a suicide. That's the record. That's what history tells us. And I know there's an article going around saying that the investigation is being revisited, but that is false information, unfortunately. But I also know I'm not the only one in feeling this way. There's something about his story that has never fully sat right with me. Not in a sensational way, not in a conspiracy theory way, but in a very human way. Kurt was clearly struggling. He was uncomfortable with fame. He was vocal about feeling misunderstood. He talked openly about pressure, control, and feeling trapped inside something he never asked for. And what's hard for me is how often that pain was minimalized or romanticized instead of taken seriously. When I look at his story, I don't see a tragedy. I see a system that failed someone repeatedly, a system that listened to the music but not the person. Whether you fully accept the official story, or whether you, like me, feel unsettled by how much we still don't understand, I think the most important part is this. Kurt Cobain needed help. He needed protection. He needed to be heard as a human being, not just preserved as an image. And instead, he became another example of what happens when pressure is normalized and pain is ignored. What connects all of these stories isn't controversy, it's discomfort. These artists made people uneasy. They spoke up, they pushed back, they refused to stay in the roles they were assigned. And when that happens, the industry rarely responds with care. It responds with punishment, silence, mockery, withdrawal of support. Looking back isn't about guilt, it's about awareness, because these patterns didn't disappear, they evolved. Understanding when the industry got it wrong helps us recognize those moments in real time, before damage becomes irreversible. These artists weren't failures, they were warnings, and the tragedy is how long it took us to listen. Before I wrap this up, I want to say something important. We've talked today about pressure, punishment, and people being pushed past their breaking point. If any part of this episode brought something up for you, or if you're struggling right now, you don't have to handle this alone. If you're in the United States, you can call or text 988, the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline, anytime, 24/7. You can also chat online at 988lifeline.org. If you're outside the U.S., please look up local crisis resources in your country. Reaching out isn't a weakness, it's care, and it matters. Thanks for listening to Off the Record. If this episode made you rethink a moment you once accepted without question, or made you more aware of how power operates behind the scenes, share it with someone who cares about music and the people who make it. I'll be back soon with another episode. Until then, keep listening closely.